And you point out that the unknown soldier carving, which occupies a central place in the chapel, sort of physically resembles him.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really sort of significant feature. The chapel is a very modest building, but the inside, the sort of full length of this rather small chapel is taken up with an effigy. And it was Anthony Gormley, one of my father's pupils, who pointed out to me that the corpse of Christ in La Pieta, Michelangelo's La Pieta, is actually the proportions of Michelangelo's body. And Gormley pointed that out to me. And of course, all Gormley's sculptures are based on his body. And he said, look at your father's sculptures. And of course, it was so obvious. And I did indeed look at my father's sculptures. And I suddenly realized they were so modeled around my own father's incredibly sort of powerful, stocky build. And the unknown soldier which lies in the chapel, in many ways, I think, symbolized the corpse that my father thought he was going to grow up to become, and indeed, sort of, but for a quirk of birth date, would have been. And there was something very poignant about the fact that he carved this corpse and put it in a chapel in the middle of the North York Moors.
You're also able to tell the story of how land use is changing, and you tell it in a very sort of fascinating way. You look at how farming is changing and how trees were planted and blocked the view of the chapel, and how tourism has completely changed the way landscape is perceived. I mean, those are interesting and closely intertwined stories, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, the forestry, I mean, again, you talk about how sort of pleasurable it is when you find connections in the research that you hadn't expected to find. And I think the story of forestry was a very satisfying story to sort of piece together and to realize how much it echoed my father's own story about experience of war in the first half of the 20th century. Because as my father was building his chapel, he built it on this extraordinary bit of land overlooking this fabulous view of the Vale of York. But as he was building, they were ploughing all the land, the hillside around him, and in fact planting coniferous plantations, which would grow up to deprive him of the view. So the chapel is now swallowed up in this big coniferous plantation. And why those trees were planted and the story, that story is all really a story about war and about Britain's experience of timber famine in the First World War. And teasing apart that history was just astonishing, because the First World War one does not think of it as a war that required a lot of wood, but in fact it required immense amounts of wood. You know, if you think of all the shuttering of all the trenches and the wooden handles of all the tools and the charcoal and that was required for feeding the troops, and the railway, they built loads of light railways in that area to bring equipment to the front lines, and all of that needed railway sleepers. So it was a dramatic moment in the First World War when the supplies from Russia were interrupted. There was no timber imports from Germany, and England realized it did not have enough timber. And that was the setting up of the Forestry Commission, led to the Forestry Commission in 1919. And the thing about the coniferous plantations in the early 1950s, over many upland areas of the north of England, was that it was, of course, the fear of the Cold War that England could again, lose its timber imports from Scandinavia and Russia, and that it had to have enough timber, because at that point the timber was being used for pit props to keep the mines going, and the mines kept the whole of British industry going. Now, all of that, of course, collapsed, as we know. The Cold War ended, and in 1989, Soviet Union, etc. So the coniferous plantations still cover many of these upland areas. They're no longer economic to sell. And I argued that, well, actually, they're a form of war memorial as well. They're a form of sort of monument to the Cold War. And the Forestry Commission is slowly, bit by bit, trying to manage these forests to make them more environmentally friendly to kind of wildlife and so forth. But it's a piecemeal approach. Some of these plantations are sort of spindly types of tree trunks, sort of propping each other up, and they're sort of, not much use to anyone, really.
We talked at the beginning about this sort of open-ended sense of reconciliation, a resolution that you achieved with your father by writing the book. But I wanted to ask you more broadly, what did you discover about yourself as a result of writing it?
I think what the book enabled me to do was to articulate something that I knew was really, really important to me. But I hadn't been able to explain why it was important to me, or to describe that importance. There's something about the kind of English landscape which is such a sort of visceral sense of connection that it's, one of the most important things really to my understanding of place and of space. I mean, I can't really describe how central they are to my sense of identity, about who I am and where do I belong. And I think what the book enabled me to do was to sort of interrogate that kind of fundamental and to honour it, really, because one of the things that if you ask me what did I learn, well, I think I didn't know I could write this book, and I didn't know how I was going to write it, and I had to change my mind dramatically at about sort of 4 or 5 months in. I stopped writing one book, which I thought I was going to write, and wrote instead an entirely different book. And the style and structure and tone of that book was all, a complete revelation to me. And I suppose the satisfaction I draw from that is that I think it enabled me to honour something that was and still is really, really important to me.
Madeleine Bunting. The plot is available now in paperback. You can find out more details on the website at blackwell.co.uk. You'll also find an archive of over 100 author interviews there. I'll be back soon with another podcast, and until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.